What is it that makes Disneyland so great? And by that I mean so captivating, so enthralling. I mean, we all know why it's fun for kids. You got colorful characters, family-friendly entertainment, and of course rides. But what is it that keeps adults coming back? For some people, no doubt, it's the rides, it's the characters, it's the tie-ins now with movies, new features. For others, it might be all the snacks and treats and foods out here. For others, it's gotta be pure nostalgia, the timelessness, the fact that you're walking around a place your parents enjoyed and your grandparents enjoyed. In fact, look at this. Here's my grandparents on Tom Sawyer Island in the 50s. For some people, it's a social thing. People can get addicted to Disneyland just like they can get addicted to any other kind of treat. And for those kind of people, Disneyland can turn into their whole lifestyle. For some people, it's the shopping, others the entertainment, but the truth is, it's probably a mix of everything. The rides, the entertainment, the characters, the nostalgia, the exciting new features and changes, the social element, and most certainly the fact that Disneyland is a place where you can come to use your imagination without shame and without embarrassment. I know for me, far and away, the biggest ingredient has got to be the creativity, or to be more specific, the artistry. I mean, to me, this whole place is a giant work of art. It's like a living museum or a movie set. In fact, it was literally created by some of the best set designers and prop makers and animators in the world. We take theme parks for granted now, and yet in the 1950s, when they were designing and building Disneyland, nothing like it had ever been built on this kind of scale or with this kind of detail or artistry or imagination. I mean, sure, there were amusement parks, dirty little parks with Ferris wheels and little kiddie rides and that kind of thing. Walt Disney really had a vision that no one else could quite see because nothing had been done like it before. And it was him witnessing the creativity of his team, his animators, his designers, his filmmakers, to realize I could do something with that. Which is why Disneyland isn't just another ropey old amusement park. It was like stepping inside of a movie, inside of a fantasy story, inside of an adventure tale. It was a whole brand new form of immersive storytelling that, like I said, we all very much take for granted today. And yet this masterpiece was itself an evolution. When the park opened in 1955, it was just the bare skeleton of the Disneyland we know today. I mean, Tomorrowland looked nothing like it would in the future. There were no submarines, there was no Matterhorn. More than half of Fantasyland was basically just big plywood style tents. Half of the park was just a bunch of dirt mounds that didn't even have any plants on it. And like I said, the reason for that is because nothing like this had ever existed before. Walt Disney was a trusted name in show business in the movies, and the bankers and financiers and money people could wrap their heads around rides and charging admission and things like that. But neither they or even the money man within the company itself could understand why he needed money for things like plants, for things like plaques, for all the little details, like even this landscaping, for instance, that goes to make Disneyland what it is. Ah yes, we'll sell popcorn and hot dogs and tickets to kiddie rides. Here's the money. Well wait, we need some money for landscaping and for props. Landscaping? Props? How do they make money? We're not giving you money for that. Because so much of what we consider to be classic Disneyland really wasn't even built until the late 50s or the early 60s, there are thousands, I mean uncountable examples of what I'm talking about. We could talk about the fact that they had no souvenirs at first, so they ended up chopping up animation cells from the films and selling them here. We could talk about how they ran out of time and money to build futuristic attractions in Tomorrowland, so half of it was corporate sponsorship displays and dairy displays and props from films. But the best example, and the one I want to zoom in on today, mostly because it ties in with everything else I've been doing lately, is my absolute favorite part of the park, Adventureland. This is the first land I wanted to enter on every childhood trip to Disneyland, and still today, this is the first place in the park that I gravitate towards. Of course, the original idea for this part of the park was to invite guests into the exotic sort of fantasy jungle parts of the world, and it's really one attraction when it opened in 1955 was the Jungle Cruise, which, believe it or not, was extremely popular, maybe the most popular ride in the whole park. I can't tell you how many thousands of hours of old vintage footage and photos there are of just the Jungle Cruise because it was so mind-blowing, and it was tied into the Walt Disney program True Life Adventures on TV, a series of nature documentaries and places around the world. The animated fake animals inside of here blew people's minds back then in a way that's really hard to appreciate today. Famously, it was very last minute getting the foliage for the Jungle Cruise. This was all orange groves before it was Disneyland, and their landscape man, Bill Evans, had to cut down some of the orange trees and flip them upside down to look like exotic jungle trees. That's how short they were on time and money. Over across the street in the 50s, there wasn't much here, but what there was a little sun-kissed stand, a little sponsorship where you could get fresh orange juice, a couple of stands and a shooting gallery over in this area, and down at the end, you did have a little sort of basic restaurant back here, one piece of which still survives that would become the Tahitian Terrace. And of course, across from this whole tropical area, the skeleton of the Adventureland Bazaar was built. But what the heck do you put in Adventureland? What do you sell for souvenirs? Coconuts? Seashells? Well, yes, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But the thing I really want to zoom in on, I really want to focus in on, is the tiki stuff, the decorations. Because when Adventureland first opened, the famous tiki room simply wasn't here. It wasn't even an idea yet. When you first entered Adventureland, there was simply nothing on the left side of your screen. You could see the back of what would become the Tahitian Terrace, but mostly there was a little watery canal on this side, meaning that this was always a bridge. In fact, it's still a bridge. And if you head through today's Adventureland gate into Adventureland itself and peer over this little fence, you can see the water is still here. It's just now there's a big old tiki room where much of it used to be. Anyway, coming into Adventureland anytime after 1962, you're immediately presented with the big facade of the tiki room, the big exterior of it. Ooh, look at that attraction right there. But in 1955, when that wasn't there yet, Adventureland had kind of an interesting idea as to its entrance, as to what pulls you in. Of course, Fantasyland, you've got the big castle. With Frontierland, when you peer through the gates, you could see the Mark Twain at the end of the street. Well, back in the day, you could anyway. 1955's Tomorrowland had a big rocket that pulled you in deeper into the land. Walt and his team actually had a name for these giant props that were meant to pull you into the land. They were called Weenies. They were meant to get you deeper inside and fully immersed in the storytelling of the land before you saw all of its attractions. But interestingly, Adventureland didn't have a weenie. All they had was its big arched gateway, which back then had a severed head and some ivory on top. That wouldn't be politically correct today. And then, of course, you saw some sort of mysterious buildings behind that. It was really unique in that it was the one land you had to enter first and then see the land unfold in front of you. There was one cool feature that's been missing for decades and decades, and that is beyond the gate back here against these walls, there was a sort of bigger planter area where that tree is, where they had a giant carved wooden tiki that I affectionately call the greeter tiki, greeting adventurers coming into Adventureland. And he wasn't alone. As you entered farther into the land itself, you would see other tikis, notably these big moai here that were actually carved out of the living palm trees. And this is really where I want to pick up our little zoom in story, because all the finishing touches in 1955 were so slapdash, they were so last second, they had to be done on the cheap, they had to be done quickly. Where did these things come from? The original stuff that was here in the park. And I don't just mean inside of Adventureland itself, not just the big tiki statues, but the backstory behind my favorite place in the park, my favorite thing in the park, which is what Adventureland had instead of a weenie: the Adventureland gates, and of course, all of the epic and exotic masks that adorn the bridge, the sidewalls, and the entryway. It didn't take much to start up my imagination as a kid, and this always threw it into overdrive. As you enter the Adventureland gates, the real weenie here, the real thing that pulls you in, or pulled me in anyway, were all these strange carvings and shields and totems. I mean, who made these? What kind of mysterious civilization came up with this stuff? What in the world could lie beyond these gates? It was almost like entering a medieval town and seeing the weird gibbet or the skulls on spikes or something. And there were skulls on spikes here back in the day, but they're gone now. Or like seeing the hangman's trees. You enter a western town. It was just like, you know, setting the scene for a movie as you enter Adventureland. Who made this? What kind of people will you find in there? What kind of adventure? I've always loved these things. They always got my mind going. It was the first thing we would do at Disneyland. These were the first thing that would suck me in to that immersive storytelling. And of course, as many of you know, this is what inspired me to start, carving masks and doing wood carvings of my own, which we'll circle back to later. But the main thing is actually the mystery itself, right? That tantalizing sort of fantasy element. Where did these come from? What secrets are awaiting you in Adventureland? And these sort of entryway masks are such a fixture, of Disneyland. Such a classic part of the storytelling that even I always assumed Disneyland has had some masks on these gates since the very beginning, but in fact, I was wrong. Back in the 1950s, other than the weird sort of dangling severed head up there on the ivory poles, there were no masks out here on these Adventureland gates, as I call them, at all. They did, however, have some shields. This is what they had, some strange painted sort of wicker-looking, rattan-looking sort of shields. And other than the greeter tiki on the back wall, there were no tiki masks, there were no jungle carvings, nothing. When they built the first version of the Adventureland entrance, it was basically just bare poles and thatch. There really wasn't much decoration to it. So what to do? They were out of time and they were out of money. How in the world are they supposed to decorate this and make it actually look enticing and interesting? Well, they simply did in Adventureland the same thing they did in Tomorrowland. They pulled out some props from the recent live-action film, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. If you've ever seen the film, you know the part of the movie where they encounter the islanders with their shields and their spears. Those shields came from the film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. They were movie props and they were thrown up here on the entrance to Adventureland sort of haphazardly and at the last minute. Pretty good, right? Problem solved. Except that the problem was only solved temporarily, because if you know anything about Southern California, the thing it's most famous for is its sunshine, and a wicker mask sitting out here in the sun and the rain and everything else was not going to last long. Meanwhile, back here in Adventureland proper, you'll remember they had that big greeter tiki, and they also had those moai, those carved moai that were actually carved into palm trees that had been standing here before Disneyland was a thing. Well, to get these carvings, Walt Disney turned to the same person he turned to fill up Adventureland's little stalls and gift shops with seashells and with driftwood and ornaments and nautical knickknacks, a name that's not that familiar to most people, a man called Eli Hedley. He was the original beachcomber. He lived down on the beach in a shack with his family. They would comb the beach for shells and trinkets and items and sell them down there. Well, Eli Hedley inspired Don the Beachcomber, Trader Vic's. All these places were decorated with stuff that he would sell them. And after World War II, the explosion of sort of tiki bars and Polynesian decor, fantasy tropical environments meant that Walt Disney, and by extension his creative team, were very familiar with these sort of tiki decorations. So Walt worked his way backwards up the chain, asking around at tiki bars and stuff, found out about Eli Hedley, who was sort of a beach bum, kind of artistic type of guy, not a big businessman, not a big money guy. And he made the Hedley family an incredible offer to become vendors at the brand new upcoming Disneyland, which of course the Hedley family couldn't afford, but Walt made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Instead of paying a big sponsorship fee to become vendors at Disneyland, in exchange for the opportunity of running their own stall, their own shops here in Adventureland, Walt simply wanted Eli to carve tikis into the palm trees around Adventureland. He adds a little bit to the decor, makes Adventureland pop a little bit, and in exchange, he got to sell his wares right over here at a little stall called Tiki's Tropical Traders. Here you can see a picture of one of the old bags for Tiki's Tropical Traders, which started in that little stall that I just showed you right around this area. And they sold, woven hats and various tropical beach type stuff, and also supplied a lot of wares for the bazaar, including coconuts and seashells, and one has to imagine maybe some coconut monkeys like this, all in exchange for creating those moai. But of course, Eli Hedley also put Walt Disney in touch with another guy who could supply decor for Adventureland, a guy that even the most hardcore of Disney fans have never heard of, a man by the name of Robert Carter. Now, Robert Carter had this sort of mystique about him. The legend was that he had traveled all around the South Seas and jungle destinations, and he had started a business in Los Angeles that supplied places like Clifton's and Trader Vic's and Don the Beachcombers, all those tiki, Polynesian, jungly places with decor. He started this import business called Cargoes by Carter. They sold thatch and matting and bamboo and stuff like that. And it was Mr. Carter who imported the carved Tahitian greeter tiki I showed you earlier and supplied some other versions of that same tiki for inside Adventureland and some of the stuff in the Jungle Cruise. Basically all the earliest building materials and sort of tropical decor for Disneyland came from Cargoes by Carter through Eli Hedley. Now really quick before we move on, a couple of things. The Tropical Traders right here, which then became Tropical Imports and is now basically just stroller parking, was basically the successor of that original Tiki's Tropical Traders. And the dates get kind of fuzzy, but it was in here. This was sort of an expansion, like a more permanent version of that little hut. And just like the Hedley family, they had barrels of rubber snakes and rubber spiders and stuff like that all the way up into this century, really. They were later consolidated, the Bizaar and the Tropical Traders, really into sort of one shopping experience here in Adventureland. And my mom actually worked over there at the Bizaar right at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, and they still sold seashell jewelry and all that kind of stuff. And they still sold the old Randotti Tikis, which is a very early vendor here. Sort of ceramic, concrete, chalkware all combined into one. I have one of those Tikis at home, and they sold fake skulls in here, and they sold little tombstones in Frontierland and at the Haunted Mansion. I got some of those at home as well. I just think that stuff is kind of neat, those old souvenirs that people were excited to get, like a straw hat or a ceramic tiki or some seashells or driftwood items. I mean, today's merch game is strong, but you have to admit the sort of mass-produced, made in China for all the Disney parks worldwide merchandise is at least very different from coming in here and being able to buy a custom-made seashell necklace collected on the beach by the Hedley family. Okay, and look at this. Back here in the Bizaar, in the very back, you have this crinkly, sort of almost paper material here. This shield, this is very similar to those early shields that would have been on the gate. But as I was just telling you, the sort of papery, pulpy, and wicker and rattan shields, those were made for movie props. They weren't meant to last. That solution did not last long. And once Disneyland had actually been here for a while and started to make money, and the finance guys could kind of understand, they spent a little bit more money acquiring some more set dressing for Adventureland to replace those original weak temporary shields. And that is how you got these. These were the very first masks put into Adventureland on these gates, on the entryway here. The first of the classic Adventureland masks. These pictures are from about 1956. They come from various sources you can see on the screen. And I don't know how closely you've been observing, but they are very, very different from the sort of masks that would end up out here later and all the way down until today. They're almost cartoony, you know, they're really colorful, they're very 1950s looking. A far cry from some of the classic masks that we've seen out here for decades, like this one right here. Now, as you may know, partly inspired by my days here in Adventureland as a kid, getting blown away by the masks, I've done a lot of wood carving lately. I've gotten very into carving sort of tiki masks, among a lot of other things. And so I've always been obsessed with gaining the skills to kind of recreate these original lost masks, the original first masks from Adventureland. By the way, I love that picture of Walt Disney gazing up at Big Red right there, huh? Fantastic. And so as I gained more carving skill over the last year, it's been my secret mission to sort of recreate or create my own versions of Walt Disney's original Adventureland Tiki Masks, which as it happens, came from Cargoes by Carter. So I'm like, oh, this is cool. I'm recreating something that nobody has seen for 60 or 70 years. And as you guys may know, a lot of the Tiki Mask designs that you see out here in Adventureland today, that have been out here really since the 1960s, were carved and designed by my friend Leroy Schmaltz at the famous Oceanic Arts. Now, Leroy taught me a lot of stuff. He taught me a lot about the inspirations behind this stuff, a little bit about carving before he passed away. I used to watch him work for hours, and I've spent a lot of time trying to duplicate some of the stuff he did, you know, just like a sketch artist will try and duplicate a Leonardo or a Michelangelo so they can kind of learn the secrets. And I was excited about recreating these early Disneyland masks because I was like, aha, I'm finally getting away from Good old Leroy, right? I'm finally carving something that was here even before Leroy started his work. So imagine my surprise when I found out that even those first 4 Adventureland Tikis that appeared in 1956 were also carved by my friend Leroy Schmaltz. You see, in 1956, Leroy and his partner Bob Van Oosting started working for Mr. Carter. They started a company called Schmaltz Van Oosting. They subcontracted for Cargoes by Carter, and they created all of his masks and war shields and all the tiki stuff. But these were some of their very earliest jobs. Disney didn't even know they were hiring Bob and Leroy. They were contracting with Mr. Robert Carter. And those first masks, particularly those first 4 masks, 2 of which, as you can see, are really the same pattern as each other, but 2 of them are very, very unique, were some of Leroy's very earliest big commercial job tiki carvings. And here's the thing, even though there are many other Leroy Schmaltz designs out here today, these ones are very different in sort of a key way. What you're seeing here is not wood, this is fiberglass. Every once in a while you'll still see the odd wooden tiki copy out here, but for the most part Disney has started to make molds of the old Oceanic Arts masks and cast them in more durable materials, coat them with resin so they're a little bit more weatherproof, a little bit more sunproof. And those original 4 masks, they were just purely carved out of wood. It was such early days that in fact they were one-of-a-kind hand carvings. So the way this works is Leroy would carve something like this. He would carve a master pattern. He'd carve it out of sugar pine or redwood or sometimes ponderosa pine. And then it's a physical process, but it would be duplicated. You put the master pattern on one side with a little machine that goes over it, on the other side by hand, and then the machine would carve out the basic shape of another tiki. And it comes out way rougher, nothing smooth like this. You have to go in, you have to kind of recarve each little spot, sand it, add the detail, add the aging, the painting. And then Leroy would have to individually paint each one of these that came out here. In fact, there's great pictures of Leroy out here at Disneyland with his masks. But that's the reason you see so many of the ones he did at the Polynesian Resort for Disney World or some of the Adventureland ones here, why you see the same mask decade after decade after decade. They're not the same individual ones, but they are made on the same sort of pattern. Well, those first original masks, they were only here in the very earliest years. After that, they never duplicated these. They had different paint schemes over the years and different stuff, obviously, as you can see, stapled or nailed or screwed onto their faces, like rags, cloth, thatch, weird stuff. If they were even using a duplicator all the way back then, they were only making a few copies of these because these would not survive into the future Disneyland or the future Adventureland. By then, Leroy had gotten more sophisticated with his carvings and these designs were sort of outdated. And although later, when they were still working for Cargoes by Carter and when they started Oceanic Arts, they went to create on sort of a stable of master patterns and sort of a catalog. And that's where you get pieces like this that you've seen recreated over and over. Of course, Disney now has their own fiberglass molds for this guy. Incidentally, this is called a New Caledonia mask, and that's where you get stuff like this right here, this male and female that inspired that shruggy Maui logo for the Polynesian. This is a Leroy Schmaltz carving, although this was him doing a version of an actual carving that was in a museum. So that's the thing, as time went on and Leroy and Bob started their own business, Oceanic Arts, they would get more and more detail. They would put more and more pieces of authentic masks and culture into their designs. And that's why you never really saw those first 4 masks duplicated out here ever again. They lasted a long time. Like I said, they were repainted many times. But of course, in 1962, the entryway into Adventureland got its biggest change ever as they started constructing Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. And once they started building the Tiki Room, that's when a whole extra layer of authenticity hit the park. Well, I say authenticity, but what I mean by that is rather than just some total fantasy pieces from 20,000 Leagues, Walt Disney got one of his most legendary artists named Mark Davis to start designing things for the Tiki Room. I just saw some of those original sketches and stuff at the Heritage Auction, the recent Heritage Auction, which started a lifelong fascination for Mark Davis with Papua New Guinea. That's why you see so much New Guinea influence on the Tiki Room. And then working with Mark Davis was Rolly Crumb, the legendary, very wacky, very groovy Imagineer who created stuff like Koro and Pele and Ngendi, sort of based on real stuff, very much inspired by actual tropical islands, sort of an amalgamation of New Guinea, some Melanesian stuff, Polynesian stuff, and of course, the almost never talked about Malaysian stuff, which has a much stronger influence over at Disney World, but you can see a little little bit of it there. See that cow head? Anyway, Leroy was involved in carving some stuff for the Tiki Room, like the next show sign over there behind that guy, and obviously some of the masks that still adorn the Adventureland gates. I know he didn't carve this guy that's above the gate now, the guy from my generation, our generation. Look at that guy up there, he's cool. But it turns out, even though I was trying to go pre-Leroy, that even those first 4 masks in Adventureland were actually some of the first 4 Schmaltz Van Oosting masks carved for Cargos by Carter. Mr. Carter may be an almost unknown name today, but that connection came through Eli Hedley, a little bit more legendary in sort of the Tiki world. That led to Oceanic Arts, and that led to me carving my carvings. It also led to me recreating my own versions of the masks from Adventureland, which I'm gonna show you in just a minute. People always ask me, what's up with carving all these carvings that you're doing? What's the obsession all about? Well, part of it's growing up across the street over there, close enough to Disneyland to fantasize about it every day, but not, you know, wealthy enough to go all the time. I think that's really what led me to obsess over like every tangible piece I could touch while I was going through the park. And then my great-grandfather was a wood carver as well. He carved a lot of ducks and animals and carousel horses and stuff like that. My dad's done a little bit of woodworking, so it's sort of in the blood also. And I've carved more than just Tiki masks, but I always enjoy carving a little bit of that old school tropical fantasy, taking little elements of the real, little elements of the imaginary, and combining them into something kind of wholesome and family friendly, a little bit misunderstood in today's days. That's really what Disneyland is all about. It's a melting pot. It's an amalgamation of different styles and different craftsmanship and different artistry. Like you had Mark Davis, he was a professor at the Show and Art Institute, so training artists, and then he came up with these masks right here. These are almost certainly based on his sketches. That's during that whole Rolly Crump era, during the building the Tiki Room era. My friend Jordan actually sent me a picture of Walt today looking at some of these masks, these fiberglass masks before they went into the park. This is in the Tiki Room era. And as you've seen, they've added a few more shields recently, which are appropriate for your fantasy jungle, but also harken back to that 20,000 Leagues connection. And even though a lot of the pieces of Adventureland were made by Leroy way back in the day, or Mark Davis or Rolly Crump, all of whom have passed on now to the other world. If you start to look around at Adventureland today, you'll notice there are still handcrafted wood carved things being added, including of course the very newest piece, the incredible hand carved wooden sign for the Adventureland treehouse, hand carved by famous Facebook wood carver Raymond Kinman. And if you've ever been in a Facebook group, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. He's not just a prolific carver, he's a prolific Facebook poster, let me tell you. And of course, his team of associates. I'm sure Disney has a lot more control over what gets made and put in their parks now in terms of the design. But it is really cool to see that not everything is just sort of a 3D design. It's not just made in Blender and then carved out of foam and with resin. That stuff is artistry too. It's very, you know, full of craftsmanship and artisticness and know-how. There's something so raw and elemental and cool about things that are hand carved out of actual wood, at least for their first phase. Something about that artistry that I really, really like. And that is one of the main things that keeps me coming back to Disneyland again and again. Okay, bear with me here because this adventure is not over yet. Just hang on. I know I've talked about Adventureland history before, and I've talked about the Tiki Mask history before in sort of a much lighter way, not as detailed, but I really wanted to focus in on those first 4 masks that were out here from 1956 onwards. 1, because I know nobody's ever really told that story before. 2, I really want to share my recreations with you, which I hope you'll find at least somewhat interesting. There's also another recreation I want to show you in a second. But 3, this is all tying together into an event that's coming up where a lot more secret Disneyland history is kind of going to be exposed. And for the first time ever, you might be able to buy a piece of the Adventureland history when it comes to those first 4 masks. You see, you may remember that sadly a few years ago, Oceanic Arts closed down. Leroy was dying, and it was a whole long process of closing down the business. I went and filmed it several times. But the main big closing event was this thing called Aloha OA. I filmed the first weekend of that. It was a big celebration. It was a big auction. Lots of those things in there went for thousands and thousands of dollars. It's hard to get an original Oceanic Arts mask now for less than a couple grand. There was also a book written about Oceanic Arts called The Godfathers of Tiki by my friend who put on that Aloha OA event. It was all done through my friend Jordan, who runs Peekaboo Gallery. Well, in addition to being a big time Tiki guru, my friend Jordan was also a big Disneyland history nut. He actually had sort of the first big Van Eaton auction before Van Eaton was Van Eaton. Their first big Disneyland auction was his big collection. So a big collector, historian. Well, last year he sort of combined his love of Tiki stuff and mid-century stuff and kind of burlesque stuff, groovy stuff into this event called Exoticon that happened in downtown LA. Dude, and talk about something being run by someone who's a fan of theming. I mean, it was insane. It was in these domes and there were projections and colors. It was super groovy and far out. There was sci-fi elements and performers of old like Exotica music. And it was this crazy, weird experience. Everyone who slept on it seriously missed out. Most of my footage, like doing a video about it, got deleted, but I did have a lot of the B-roll. And just looking back through it now, I can't even believe how epic looking that was. It all felt like a weird fever dream. It was so cool. Well, now it's about to go a step further and get even cooler because they've designed a whole new show, a whole new experience called Exoticon 2 that's coming up. And the reason I'm so excited about this one is they're not just gonna have more symposiums about Tiki and, you know, sort of mid-century stuff, but they've also brought epic, rare, and obscure Disneyland history into the mix this year. So there's gonna be crazy panels about Disney theme park music. There are Imagineers on these panels. There's gonna be all this cool history uncovered. They've got performers that used to perform in the parks that are coming out. So this obscure deep dive history, if that's your thing, this is gonna be a really cool festival. And I was gonna go anyways, but on top of that, I thought I gotta get in on this, right? I've been doing all these carvings. I did a practice run earlier this year, but this is the first time I'm gonna be a vendor really at a big Tiki sort of, or tangentially related to Tiki event. And that's why I decided not to use eBay or anything else. That's why I decided to debut my versions of the original masks at Exoticon. So my carvings will be there and I will be there to meet and greet and all that kind of stuff. Of course, I will have my new book there. I will be signing books. I'll be selling Tiki masks. And I know none of you guys know this, but even though I'm kind of a psycho about not showing my projects while they're in process, like not showing them till they're finished works of art or whatever they are, I'm gonna head down the street in a couple of minutes here as the sun begins to go down to my private home. And if you got a couple more minutes, I want you to come with me because I want to show you what I've been working on and show you how I'm trying to bring the past of Adventureland into the future of Exoticon. I think there's some stuff you are really going to like. And again, this is all going to tie in stuff about Tomorrowland history and other parts of the park we haven't even got to. It's not a Tiki thing. That's sort of a misconception about it. Tiki's a part of it, but so is history, so is anything mid-century, sort of exotic, strange, sci-fi, futuristic, you know, mid-century futuristic. I can't even tell you, it's the coolest thing ever, especially if you're into history, anything cool, groovy, weird. I have a lot of friends who do cool stuff and make cool stuff. You know, we have that in common. We just want to make cool things. And you know, if someone's my friend, I'll gladly shout out their project or their thing, or I'll post about it on Instagram or in the Facebook group or something like that. But last year I went to Exoticon and I thought it was so insane that I was like, dude, no matter what, if this ever happens again or any version, I got to be part of this show. It's not just a festival, it's not just an event, it's a show and I want to be part of it. Like, it's dancing and it's music and there's bars and all that stuff, but there's also these crazy historical symposiums and really like well-known authors and Imagineers and historians. It's insane. And so usually in the summer, I do this convention called Midsummer Scream. It's the largest Halloween convention anywhere, Halloween and Haunter convention, especially on the West Coast. I do that in Long Beach every year. I meet and greet with people. But this year I'm actually skipping it just so I can be a part of Exoticon 2. And the thing is, you know, it's just a once in a lifetime thing. Each event is once in a lifetime. And since I've only got one lifetime, I had to be a part of this. All right, the sun is going down now over Adventureland and all its weenies. So let me take you back to my place and show you my Tiki in a not nearly as weird as it sounds kind of a way. This took a lot out of me today. It was the first time I've really been out since kind of recovering from an illness. I was in the hospital and I had all this medication and but it was worth it. I'm glad I finally had the strength to make it out here and I'm really excited to show you my little piece of Disneyland history recreated for the first time, as far as I know, in more than 50 years. All right, let's go. Okay, you're gonna have to pardon the mess over here. This has basically been a factory for a while. Ignore the classic bikes that need repairs. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to find a bike shop to restore classic Columbia bicycles in Southern California, but that's a whole other story. Let's head inside the famous Leroy Schmaltz Memorial Workshop, which is an absolute disaster, and I'm sorry I don't have any refreshments to offer you at the moment. There's been a lot of work going on here, and like I say, I'm usually very opposed to showing people any work in progress. But you know what? For those of you who subscribe to this channel, you're basically like my best friends. I might as well bring you in. Okay. And this is what I want to show you. As you can see, there are all kinds of various works in progress stacked up, but some of them might look a little bit familiar to you, because among the rest of the Tiki masks and carvings I've been working on for Exoticon, nestled in there like E.T. among the stuffed animals are some replicas. Or I guess I shouldn't say replicas, I should say some tribute versions, my versions of some original Adventureland Tiki masks. As far as I know, since the original Leroy carved out of wood by hand, ones that were in Adventureland in the 1950s, 1956 to about 62 or 63, no one's ever made these designs ever since, as far as I can tell. You know, as you can see, these ones are not finished. This one's still in the process of being painted. So is this one technically. This one's more or less done, and it's pretty darn close. This guy, Big Red right here, is pretty darn close to the way the one looked that Walt Disney was peering up at in that classic photo from the Walt Disney Archives. The major difference being, for years I would see that picture of Walt looking up at this Tiki mask here. I'd be like, that's so cool. It's very kind of clowny and cartoony compared to what you'd see there nowadays or what you'd see from Oceanic Arts later on. But I thought it was such a cool design. I always wanted to do versions of these masks, but what I couldn't see from that photo is, and I did see way later after I had finished carving out this master pattern here, is that the original versions had weird little ears on them. That was not based on anything like authentic out in the carved mask world or anything. That just seems to be completely random, sporadic. Who knows? Maybe Disney asked for it. All I know is in later iterations of those same masks, the ears disappear. What I mean by later iterations is that even though they never made these particular masks ever again, sort of versions of them were produced. So like this guy evolved into a much more authentic looking design Oceanic Arts put out. One of the old master patterns of which I actually have in my house, and you can see the design is somewhat similar. You got a similar mouth shape, so that survives. Similar kind of eyes, a little bit of a similar nose. And I did this master pattern, and then only afterwards did I see those old vintage photos where you have the weird little elf ears on them. And I decided, you know what, I've seen a lot of Tiki masks in my day. I've never seen any Tiki masks with elf ears. I think I'm gonna have my version without the elf ears, you know? So it's not a perfect replica, and obviously some proportions are different because I carved this by hand, but let me tell you, when I say that my first goal in ever, like doing any wood carving, I was like, if I ever carve a Tiki, I wanna do these first 4 masks. I'm not kidding. The very first Tiki mask I ever carved, I was trying to carve this one here, because this is another one that always got my attention, the one in the middle, in those historic photos right there. And suffice to say that my first attempt at doing this was not exactly historically accurate. It was it took a couple of left turns there. So I'm very pleased because that's a pretty much dead ringer. This one you see here has got a lot of work left to do on it, but eventually it'll look like this, one of those 4 original masks. I'm very, very excited about these. So, first place these will be debuted and seen in their full finished glory will be at the Exoticon Festival. I did make master patterns on them in true Oceanic Arts style, but as simple as they look, I can see why they opted for different patterns and different masks to make for Disneyland later on, because they're hard to finish, which is a hard thing to explain, but take it from me, although I'll be able to make maybe more in the future, it's going to be pretty rare because they're kind of obnoxious. I see why the designs were changed so much over the years. All right, let me grab these out of here so you can really see them. Okay, there we go. It's weird colored lighting in here. Sorry, I got a bad lighting situation. My main lights are kind of burnt out at the moment, but you can see we've also got this guy. The guy I was showing you from the Adventureland gate earlier, he was kind of a pain to carve out too. That's my version of him. I have carved out my ultimate tribute to our era of Adventureland. And then we've got all kinds of other masks over here. Everything from, you know, Tahitian inspired stuff to New Guinea inspired stuff. Oh, here's kind of an interesting piece. This is a tribute to mine and Spike's late friend Andrew, who was Mr. Tiki Head. There was a guy who would just show up to Tiki events with these giant paper mache heads. This was my favorite of the heads, probably the rarest one he wore. I don't know what happened to it after he passed away, sadly, a few years ago, but I always wanted to do a little tribute carving of my friend Mr. Tiki Head, so I'm going to do one of these for Spike's Breezeway and take one to Exoticon. I don't know if it's going to be for sale or if I'm going to give it away or what. My little Mr. Tiki Head tribute. This right here is an original design. I like to call it my Tiki Monkey because somehow he sort of came out looking like a monkey, which is a little bit weird. Then I've got some other tributes here to different stuff, different memories, and different little elements of stuff that inspired me, incorporated into original designs. Of course, they're all sitting under here, underneath the Big Papa, this big old mask carved out of redwood by Leroy. And it doesn't look like much at the moment in a pile like this, but this represents probably, I don't know, months of work. And even after I got out of the hospital and I was on horrible medication, I could not move around. I had hobble out here when I was dizzy. I had to hold on to stuff to get out here and just try to do a little bit of sanding or anything that I could. And as you can see over here on the workbench, I got a completely redone version of my old Tiki that everyone says looks like a little Frankenstein looking, little Franken Tiki action. Here's a very roughed out version of another Mr. Tiki head. I got these little moai. I'll probably never make these again. These were also tough, just very small. I like working in a big scale, not a small scale. It's hard for a person with my kind of attention span. I got my little moai here. These are some like thinner ones. I just thought it'd be neat to have something that was a little cheaper because they have to be expensive. I mean, these take hours and hours and hours worth of work to carve and finish and sand. And even when they're copied, like from a pattern, like I'll make a master pattern and then they have to be, they're hand copied. I don't know how to explain it. It's a whole jig and a long process. They come very, very rough and I have to spend almost as much time as it takes to carve out the originals to straighten them and sand them and carve little details on them. And then there's the painting and the staining and the sometimes the varnishing and a whole long process, the hanging and then the taking them somewhere. It's only now that I really understand why they were so expensive. I mean, 25 years ago, I remember going to Oceanic Arts and something like this off the shelf. Actually, this one off the shelf would have been $300, $400 painted. If you got a plain, it might have been, I don't know, maybe $300, something like that. I just think, man, that's kind of pricey, you know? And they had a whole shop with people to help finish and do all that stuff. Now I totally get it. A one-man operation doing this yourself. And then the wood isn't cheap. All my master patterns. And some of these, like the monkeys, these are each carved. Even though this monkey and that monkey look exactly the same, they are completely hand-carved from scratch, penciled out each time from this wood, which is the last of Leroy's mask-making sugar pine. And so most of them, some of them are made from that. This one is, this big giant mask right there is made out of Oceanic Arts sugar pine. So the wood can be very expensive depending on where you get it from, or very rare depending on what it is. So to me, that's like crazy legacy wood right there, you know, almost like a holy relic. And now everything's inflated so much. So sometimes these things can go $300, $400, $500 and up. And so I just wanted to have a couple thin ones, which ended up taking just as much time to carve out and smooth out, but just a couple that could be like, you know, like $100 or something like that. I don't know. I have to figure it all out. It's a very hard thing to calculate because for me, it's not like a business. This is literally art that I am creating, you know, one little piece at a time. But as you can see, there's a lot of it. So this represents months and months worth of work. And this isn't it. There are more coming that I'm not showing you yet. Some other kind of loosely Disney inspired ones. I wanted to have some Disney inspired, especially historical Disney stuff inspired for Exoticon to tie in with the theme of the show. And then I do lots of other carvings too, by the way. So like I've done a few Splash Mountain carvings, and there's a Snow White carving back over here. And I've worked on all kinds of different signs and old Western carvings and different stuff. It's just at the moment, this is what I'm working on. And I don't take commissions or anything like that. It's purely like whatever I feel like making is what gets made. So that's what you see before you is what I felt like making. Apparently I felt like making a lot. So I'll have quite a few items to go to Exoticon. If there's anything left over, sure, I'll shoot it up on eBay, you know, every once in a while, because this summer I'm going to be out on the road. My son is now 17. This is the last year that I'm the boss, right? And the last summer, and I know he wanted to sit home and play video games the entire summer vacation, but I am dragging him out on a road trip through a big slice of America, possibly Route 66, or possibly just a crazy cross-country thing, a Cannonball Run type of situation. I'm not sure. Sorry, not Cannonball Run. I was thinking of Midnight Run. Midnight Run, which is another reason that I'm not going to do Midsummer Screen this year. I'm only going to do Exoticon. I may do a book signing in the Las Vegas area. And which is why, by the way, you can still get personalized books. We have them in hand now to ship out. You can still get personalized books from me only right now, only for the next week or two. And then after that, I can't do personalization online. I'm going to be gone all summer. We're going to be filming Random Land. We're going to get back to work. Like I said, I was just in the hospital, and then I was here for 2 weeks, just completely down. The last video I did took a month to finish. And if you didn't see that, that was one with the VFX, and that was this cool, epic filming locations video about this movie no one's ever heard of called Gunga Din. It was this epic adventure getting that done. It was a whole reach and a whole different process than any other video I've ever. It's more like a documentary. Go watch it. If you haven't seen it, you don't have to have seen the movie. It helps, but you don't have to have seen it. It's pretty cool. So in other words, I gotta get back to work. I had diverticulitis, ischemic colitis, all kinds of internal problems, which I'm still healing from, and it's going to take a while. I probably shouldn't have been at Disneyland walking around all day, and I probably going to need 2 days to recover just from the little amount of very slow old man walking around that I just did with you guys. But I will be at Exoticon. It is June 9th. It's the second day, so you'll see a 2-day thing. The first day is a small thing, almost a pre-party. It's the second day, Sunday, June 9th, Exoticon.com. Use my code, though, in the description, because apparently I was going to shout it out and do all this stuff anyways, because I want to be part of the show. I'm doing all this, but I just got told yesterday, after, I was already way invested. It's like, hey, man, if anybody buys a ticket through this link, you get a little percentage. So if you want to help me out, come get a ticket to Exoticon, help yourself out, come buy some tikis, bring cash if possible, or just come say hi, come buy a book, whatever you want to do. But use the link down below, and apparently I get a little tiny percentage, which is pretty cool. That'll help. And all the proceeds of this are going towards being on the road all summer, and especially towards taking my kid out with me on the road. It doubles the cost of everything, and sometimes he's going to want to have his own adjoining room and all that kind of stuff. So it doubles the cost of just me running around not eating all day. And want to make an epic, kind of memory, the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon and all that stuff. So it's time for memory making. He wants to stay home and play video games with his friends. I'm like, no, you're coming with me. I know you'll be kicking and screaming now. It's a teenager thing. I did the same thing. But I wouldn't trade the memories that I have with my parents doing stuff for anything. So I'm taking that kid out on the road, come heck or high water. But yeah, as far as I know, this is the first time Big Red over here or his friends have been recreated. And there's so many different paint schemes that they did on these same masks over the years that it's hard to keep it super authentic. I've got as old school, as close to 1956, as close to Walt looking at it as I possibly can. They are my takes on them, so they're not perfect replicas. But I think they're as close as has ever been made in 60 years or so. I mean, a long time. This is still a lot of work. There's still a lot more to do, and I only have so much time until Exoticon actually happens. So anyway, yes, if you want to come to Exoticon, please, I'd rather prefer you bring cash. Bring a few $100 bills and come get some tiki goodness. The book is still available. Like I said, it's still personalized for like a week or two, and then that's it. There will be more events because I'm not doing Midsummer Scream. And yes, Exoticon is a ticketed event. It's a whole big hullabaloo. So I'll try to do some things later on at the end of the summer or in the fall that are much less expensive and easier to get to me to do meetup things to make up for not doing Midsummer Scream. But I don't know what they're going to be yet, and I don't know when they're going to be yet. And for all I know, it could be 2025 before they actually happen. So if you want to come see me, guaranteed to come see me at Exoticon, I will be there. Or I will be square, or I'll be under the ground or something, because I can't see what's going to stop me. And I still have a lot more work to do. So I'm going to double this amount, I hope, or at least half again before the show. I need more henchmen. I need like sanding henchmen. People are, I'm the master sander. I could sand anything or something. But I have done every single one of these. It's all been finished and painted and carved. The masters were all carved by me. I have one friend who helps me copy carve them out. Which is just basically the main shape, and then I got to go and do all the stuff myself. And they're all either made from the last of the Oceanic Arts stuff. Those will be the more pricey ones. The last of the Oceanic Arts wood, or there's some that are made out of ponderosa and stuff. We're doing it out of pine, like the really old school days. Trying to do it really, really old school, as opposed to redwood, or doing, I could make molds of them and pull resin pulls, and we can be making plastic tikis, and it'd be so much cheaper and easier. Or I could send them overseas to be copied on some industrial scale. But like I said, this isn't some kind of crazy big business for me. This is a passion project and an art project, really. It's a tribute to our grandparents' era of entertainment and to the old school Disneyland, Adventureland type of stuff. The stuff that's maybe not as popular today, but it's you know, it's a heart project, a passion project. Basically just the way Random Land is, you know? Like, I didn't want to just do a video about, hey, I got some cool carvings. I wanted to do a deep dive into the history with you and really get passionate about it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. You know, I could probably make a video about, like, look at the new churro flavor. That'd get 10 times the views, but it's not about that for me. It's about the art, it's about the passion, it's about what we're really into. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, checking this stuff out with me. If you're able to make it to Exoticon, that will be sweet. I would love to see you out there. If you're into this stuff and you want a little piece of art or a little piece of history, I'll have these all for sale there. If you want the book is around. And if you're really into Random Land and you'd like to join up for the oldest, schoolest, coolest show, you can always keep up with me on Patreon. We have the morning announcements on there, sort of like a daily vlog thing. We've got podcasts, and it's a way to keep the show on the road. If you prefer buying a piece of art to help, hey, maybe do that too. But even just watching this, and spending this much time diving with me into a weird deep dive in a very specific part of Disney history, I can't thank you enough just for watching. So thank you guys very much for sticking around. Thank you for hanging out with me. Thank you for coming into my very dusty garage. If any of you know someone in Southern California who can meticulously restore and has old parts for old Columbia bicycles, let me know. And at the moment, I've got to get back to work. And you've done your duty. You can go home and sleep well. Virgil Earp? Oops, my bad. I thought that was Sam Elliott. That guy looked awesome. And so as I gained more skill?